Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our art talk this afternoon with Professor Thomas Brenner. My name is Laurie McGavin-Bachman, and I work in the Adult Programs Department here at the library. I also organize the Art Talk series here. Our art talks are dedicated to exploring the creative process through lectures, films, and workshops that focus on art, architecture, and design. Our next art talk will take place on February 6th at 2 p.m. and will feature a fascinating film celebrating the work of renowned African-American photographer Gordon Parks, who explored the intersection of art and social justice and influenced a generation of young artists, photographers, filmmakers, and activists. We will screen the film and then have a talk back with Richard Klein, exhibitions director from the Aldrich Contemporary Art Museum, and Monica Berra, producer of the film. I would also like to thank our co-sponsors this year, the Ridgefield Guild of Artists, the Aldrich Contemporary Art Museum, and the Kundart Film Foundation. Also, please take a look at our resource table on your way out. There's a number of titles you might be interested in checking out. Now about our program today. Thomas Brenner will present the history of photography, part 2, following up on part 1, which took place on November 14, and focused on the invention of photography in the 19th century and earlier. In part 2, Brenner will further explore the evolution of photography in the 20th and 21st centuries by focusing on distinct artistic movements of photography and the modernist impetus to overthrow traditions of the past and experiment with new materials. Brenner will finally address how the emergence of digital technology in the 21st century completely transformed the practice of photography. Thomas Brenner is a professor of art and design at Housatonic Community College in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Brenner previously taught at Sacred Heart University, Silvermine School of Art, and Silvermine School of Art. He holds a BA in Fine Art from Yale University and an MFA in Interdisciplinary Arts from Goddard College. Without further ado, will you please welcome Thomas Brenner.
Thanks a lot, everyone. I guess without any further ado, once we get the lights off, we'll start. Okay, welcome to part 2 of the history of photography. If you missed part 1, you'll be fine. And there's not much we can do about it. So I should acknowledge that as an artist, my primary focus is on the photograph more so than the camera that took it or the subsequent work in the darkroom. But the development of the equipment and processes is linked to the aesthetics. So allow me to begin with an extremely brief technical rundown/review before I get to the art of the matter. Okay. The principle behind the first camera, the camera obscura, has been known for thousands of years. A tiny hole in a wall will project an inverted image of the view outside on the opposite wall. You may never have seen this, nonetheless it is true. You see it in a 16th century engraving and in this shot of contemporary installation by artist Abelardo Morel, who specializes in its use. In the past, countless inventors searched for some means of preserving the camera obscura's projection. In the early 1800s, working independently and largely unaware of one another, Joseph Nicephore Niepce in France and William Henry Fox Talbot in England tried applying photosensitive materials to a surface and placing it inside their camera obscuras, which are the two cameras we see here. Both succeeded in producing the earliest machine-made pictures, which we see below, views out the window. But among other factors, there was one enormous difference between the two processes. The French daguerreotype process produced a single positive image upon a metallic plate in the camera. No negative was made, meaning no additional copies could be printed. The English calotype process produced a negative image on paper, which we see on the left. When the negative was placed upon a second sheet of photosensitized paper and the process was repeated, a positive image was created. A negative of a negative was a positive. Talbot's method allowed multiple copies to be made and ultimately led to what we now call photography. But the daguerreotype had one big advantage. The directness of the process and the smooth surface of the metal plate meant that the image was vastly superior in quality. The absorbent fibrous surface of the paper negative and print created an irregular or muddy image by comparison, which you see below. In any event, additional positive processes, direct positive processes were developed, despite the inability to make copies, for they were quicker and less expensive, big advantages for the middle-class public. In addition to the daguerreotype, which we see here, which was introduced in 1839, the cyanotype appeared 4 years later. The process produced a single blue image on paper. In 1851, the ambrotype was introduced, creating a unique image on glass. The tintype came 5 years later. The image was created on tin and was especially popular in America due to its ease and lack of expense. Thousands of Civil War soldiers carried tintypes of their loved ones into battle or left an image of themselves at home. The key necessity for the calotype's negative positive process was to improve the quality of the image. This is a calotype by actually Hill and Adamson from the 1840s. In 1851, the textured paper negative was replaced by a smooth, transparent glass in what was dubbed the wet collodion process. This method was equal to the daguerreotype in the quality of the image, and the negative meant that countless copies could be made. Unfortunately, the glass needed to be coated with the wet emulsion, which was a cotton-like substance, the picture taken, and the negative processed all within a space of 15 minutes. But the results were beautiful, and multiple images were possible, so this became the gold standard. In 1880 came the photogravure, the first efficient photomechanical process, allowing the mass printing of photographic images. Prior to that, any photographic image that was in a publication or whatever would have had to been produced in the darkroom. But the results, a metal plate was photosensitized, exposed to a negative, etched in an acid bath, inked, and printed in the press. Finally, in 1890, the gelatin silver print was introduced with improvements to the photosensitive silver and suspension that coated the paper. I include digital not because there's any negative, but because it can produce, obviously, multiple copies. But now, we'll go ahead here. Okay. There were also additional improvements to the camera. In 1888, there was the continuous roll film. So it was the first time film was being used, and this was brought out by Kodak. It produced 100 circular negatives on a continuous roll, which had to be sent into Kodak in order to have the film processed. In 1900, Kodak introduced the Brownie, which is the first mass-marketed camera. It had a fixed lens, but the public was able to use it with a great deal of ease. In 1913, Leica introduced 35 millimeter film, which initially, interestingly, was actually just motion picture film turned on its side. In 1948, Polaroid introduced the instant camera. Konica introduced a point-and-shoot autofocus camera in 1978. 3 years later, Sony released the first digital camera that was extremely expensive, and actually at first it was connected to a device that was about the size of a contemporary printer. In 1986, Fuji made the first single-use camera, and the world changed in 2000, which it's hard to believe that a cell phones were ever that size, when they introduced the cell phone camera. But now let's look at what all of these cameras and all of these processes were able to lead to. Okay, so in the first presentation, I showed Turkish photography as a single example of international practitioners. But I promised that I would get to some other nations today. And we're going to, you can see these statues in China that were photographed by Lai Feng, who was a famous Chinese photographer. But of course, there were also adventurous European photographers who recorded images of people and places spanning the globe. And as might be expected, some of their output was exploitive or condescending. This is a notable example. But other Europeans showed a genuine interest and respect in the places and the people that they visited. While this was taking place, indigenous photographers, which is what I really want to focus on, were also starting to appear. We only have time for a few diverse examples, so we'll start with Russia. A number of Russian photographers shot rugged landscapes like these mountains in Planetskaya, a remote mountainous region situated on the Litsa River, while others were busy shooting more familiar sites like the Kremlin and Moscow. Many focused on the striking features and ethnic clothing of the regional folk of the Russian steppes. And others specialized in commissioned portraits of the aristocracy. Not to mention the cultural elite like Leo Tolstoy, who we see in an early instance of genuine color photography, which I'll get back to towards the end of the program. Africa, specifically sub-Saharan Africa. Photography had become a business, and so Europeans marketed images of exotic locales like Egypt to satisfy public curiosity back home. On the other hand, the indigenous photographers of sub-Saharan Africa devoted their energy less to the landscape of their home and more to satisfying the growing demand for portraits. Western Africa was particularly fertile ground, and the photographs were often impressive, as can be seen in this image of a Senegalese woman, or this one of a tribal chief from Sierra Leone. And these are from the 1880s. In part one, we encountered Augustus Washington briefly, a so-called free-born person of color who had relinquished his Boston studio in order to emigrate to Liberia, where he established one of the earliest photographic enterprises on the continent. Here we have Washington's portraits of two more American expatriates. On the left is Chancey Brown, who served the Sergeant at Arms of the Liberian Senate, and James Mook's Priest is on the right, a Presbyterian missionary. In Togo, Alex Agbadio Agoletsi ran a successful portrait studio, often posing as subjects in elegant European formal wear, as seen in the self-portrait on the left, as well as this portrait of two Togolese brothers. Agoletsi apparently targeted a wealthy clientele, but other practitioners concerned themselves with recording the vanishing face of the traditional culture, be it a West African king or a remote village encampment. A widespread interest in photography pervaded 19th century India. Two figures dominated the field. First, there was Raja Deen Dayal. He was trained as an engineer, but after being introduced to the camera on his job, switched to photography. Within a few years, he had opened his studio, photographing temples and palaces, both old and new. Dayal also documented darbars, that is, parades, hunting parties, and royalty, becoming the court photographer for 6 state rulers and eventually for Queen Victoria herself. This meant accommodating autocrats and colonial powers, but such were the times. In fact, the second of the two foremost photographers was of royal lineage himself, Maharaja Sawai Ram Singh, seen here in a self-portrait posing as a sadhu, or holy man. With 6,050 individual photographs in 105 albums and 1,941 glass negatives, Singh was no amateur, but was a first-rate photographer, often shooting portraits of fellow courtiers and on occasion documenting life on the street like these wrestlers. Japan. For hundreds of years, Japan had been the most insular of nations, closing its ports to all foreign travelers and businesses. It's therefore ironic that it was so strongly influenced by two expatriate photographers. Felice Beato, who we see looking rather disheveled at the center left, and surrounded by associates, and Baron Raymond von Stilfried, each established studios in the port of Yokohama. Both businesses specialized in hand-colored prints, exploiting the skills their Japanese staffs had mastered in tinting traditional graphic prints. The Japanese assistants they mentored inherited the studios when the Europeans moved on and maintained their essential approaches. The most common subject matter included portraits, landscapes, genre, both in the studio and on the street, and the occasional bathing scene or nude. Their most successful successor was Kusakabe Kimbe, who eventually took over both studios. And this is some of his work. The amber type, a positive photograph on glass, was also popular in Japan. It failed to catch fire in Europe due to the fact that, like the daguerreotype, the process produced a single, unreproducible image. Japanese amber types were generally mounted in a decorative hand-carved wooden box that protected the fragile surface. China. Portraiture was the primary subject matter in 19th century China. Ling Shitai specialized in photographing high-ranking Cantonese officials, and Sei Yuming ran a successful studio catering to the wealthy society of Shanghai. Lia Fang, the most acclaimed Chinese practitioner, shot just about everything. These actors, waterfronts, and street scenes. The craze for photography even reached faraway Siam, that's today's Thailand. This portrait of the king is by Francis Chit, who learned the craft from Christian missionaries, while the Javanese court photographer Kasian Sefas learned the craft at the bidding of the Sultan himself. To close this little section, a visit to the other side of the world and Brazil. This beautiful coastal landscape was shot by Brazil's greatest indigenous photographer, Mark Ferrez, who we see here, his great beard mark, who also took this image of the European railroad magnates and engineers, rather arrogant-looking fellows, at least those two on the front, judging by their appearance. Brazil can claim the awful distinction of allowing legal slavery until 1900, the last nation in the world to do so. Ferrez documented enslaved domestic servants, as well as workers on the nation's fertile plantations. His portraits of Brazilian slaves reflect their inherent dignity and strength. And now for one final country to which I have not given due attention. In keeping with its fervor for the new and unexplored, America was perhaps the most fertile ground for this new-born art form. And in pushing west, exploring the vast unknown, American photographers found spectacular vistas to record their cameras. The Civil War proved to be the training ground for many photographers who later documented the Great Migration westward in all its drama and danger. While some traveled alone, others joined the countless wagon trains on their rugged journey, this one risking a treacherous crossing of the Ute Pass in 1878. Photographers like Andrew Russell, who had been one of the Civil War photographers, documented the construction of the railroads that eased passage for those who followed. The California gold rush helped spur the exodus. And here's the great photographer, Carlton Watkins, prospecting for gold. This wet collodion print by Watkins features one of the most oft-recorded sites in the West, the magnificent Yosemite Valley. Watkins wrangled a dozen or more mules carrying roughly 2,000 pounds of equipment, including his oversized camera, large glass plates, and flammable chemicals. Timothy O'Sullivan, a key member of Matthew Brady's Civil War team, photographed the equally majestic rock formations of Arizona's Canyon de Chelly. But what of the first Americans who had inhabited these landscapes? The foremost photographer to focus on their vanishing world was Edward S. Curtis. In 1906, J.P. Morgan provided Curtis with $75,000 to produce a series of books on Native Americans. This work was planned to be 20 volumes with 1,500 photographs. Morgan's funds were to be dispersed over 5 years solely to cover expenses. Curtis received no salary for the project, which in the end was to last more than 20 years. Under the terms of the arrangement, Morgan was to receive 25 sets and 500 original prints as repayment. By the time he was done, Curtis was penniless and had been deserted by his wife and children. He was largely forgotten until long after his death, when his magnificent project was rediscovered and hailed as a masterwork. Now let's return to where I left off a few weeks ago and continue tracking the aesthetic progress of photography as an art form. Softened focus and textural manipulation in the camera and darkroom had been the very lifeblood of the pictorialist movement that reigned at the end of the 19th century. This is a still life by Baron Adolf de Meyer. But as early as 1905, the aesthetic scene in the de Meyer still life was rejected for the more authentic approach of what was dubbed straight photography. This rope was shot by Edward Weston. The same contrast is seen between these two images of the dance, the first by pictorialist Karl Struss, the second straight from photographer Imogen Cunningham. Straight photography's true heyday arrived on the West Coast during the late 20s and 1930s, when such luminaries as Weston, Ansel Adams, and Cunningham formed the group F-22, the name derived from the smallest f-stop on most cameras, a setting that brings the maximum amount of material into sharp focus. Ironically, the man who imported the pictorialist aesthetic from Europe and who had founded its American mecca, the Dowry 291, was also one of the two figures most responsible for its demise, and that's this man, Alfred Stieglitz. The steerage, which we see here, dates from 1907 and was one of the first chinks in the dam. It is possibly the most famous image in the history of American photography and constituted a move away from the stylistic trademarks of pictorialism. The steerage features a straightforward, unmanipulated focus on an unvarnished moment that nonetheless possesses an abstract compositional strength. A view from the upper deck of a passenger ship, it records the crowded multitudes of the poor as they mill around on the lower deck. Compositionally, the image is structured around the diagonal of the ramp. It's actually a whole series of diagonals, leading your eye this way and that. Across the crowd and more subtly punctuated by the illumination of one passenger's round straw hat as he gazes below. And in writing about it, Stieglitz actually makes about a page worth of fuss about that straw hat. Apparently he didn't have his camera with him when he first saw this scene. He went running off to his stateroom and came back and was delighted to see the guy was still there. While projecting none of the narrative touches of pictorialism, nor indulging in the earlier school's romanticism, it makes an implicit social statement through purely formal means. Note the contrast with Stieglitz's earlier image of Breton wives on the coast with its exaggerated texture, softened focus, and implied narrative of long-suffering wives awaiting the return of their seafaring men. And this was one of the early pictorialist images that really brought it to America. Paul Strand was Stieglitz's partner in establishing the rigorous tenets of straight photography. Ironically, we see Strand here in a pictorialist portrait. Strand's 1915 Wall Street bridges the gap between pictorialism and the straightforward technique that was to follow. The image epitomizes straight photography as a balance between unalloyed realism and the abstraction of form. To quote the great painter, Giorgio Morandi, nothing is more abstract than reality. And judging by these next four images, Edward Weston would agree. These photographs are not so much about flesh or vegetables or even the skull of a steer. They are explorations of shape, volume, surface, and light. No effects have been added. Nonetheless, the photographer's voice is heard, his vision shared. Imogen Cunningham's 1931 portrait of Frida Kahlo also qualifies as straight photography through its purity and lack of artifice. When compared to an earlier pictorialist portrait by Cunningham, we see a dramatic shift in approach. Members of the movement detected abstraction in man-made objects, like Strand's movie projector and bowls, and in organic forms, like Edward Weston's cabbage and artichoke, as well as in plants and flowers by Imogen Cunningham. I love Imogen Cunningham. She went on to spend 2 years photographing magnolias as a formal exploration, and the one on the right is number 1. Straight photography encompassed the widest range of subjects and approaches as long as they presented an untainted record of our visual world. Everything from Weston's infamous toilet, he spent 2 weeks in Mexico shooting this thing, to Ansel Adams' magnificent view of Half Dome in Yosemite. From Stieglitz's countless studies of Georgia O'Keeffe's hands, they were married at the time, to Charles Shearer's industrial landscapes. One might ask, after viewing all this variety, so just what the heck is straight photography? And in the end, the answer may well be, well, I cannot say what straight photography is, but I can tell you what it isn't, and that's pictorialism. Not all photography was concerned with aesthetics. The form had the unique ability to instantaneously record the state of our world and, in revealing, transform it. Since its invention, reformers have seized upon this potential, using it to achieve their ends. Not long after its invention, I can't play this photograph, the camera documented the cruelty and injustice of American slavery. The horror of this shot is intensified when paired with the following image, reflecting the casual goodwill of that victim as he enlisted to fight for the attention in a manner more powerful than words, though they lost some of that power when converted into engravings that the newspapers called for reform. So this was before the photogravure allowed the reproduction in mass of photographic imagery. The impassive gaze of this owner stands in bleak contrast to the intriguing eyes of her young slave. And Harriet Tubman, the abolitionist founder of the Underground Railroad, collected photographs of those she freed in her massive photo album. The camera may have galvanized public opinion, and yet, if not by name, then certainly by practice, slavery persists to this day. The chained feet of an American miner say this is so. Incidental images of the poor have been recorded since the camera's invention, but the first to battle the scourge with this camera intentionally was British photographer John Thompson, first during his travels in China in the 1860s, which we see here, and subsequently upon his return to London 4 years later. Thompson's genuine respect and concern for the unfortunate was evident in the dignity of his images. They also display his technical and compositional skill. By the turn of the century, other figures like Horace Warner also were focusing on London's poor and on the horrid working conditions many endured. Children made great chimney sweeps with their ability to squeeze through narrow passages. You'll never know how many suffocated or suffered lung disease in the process. Young were also sought for other unpleasant jobs like rat catching due to their vulnerability and need. While these social and human ills were being unveiled in England, 2 outstanding crusaders were at work in America. This wonderful photograph is by Jacob Riis, who we see here, who had shifted from walking the beat as a crime reporter to becoming a reformer, documenting the rampant poverty in the Five Points district of lower New York. There, the immigrant population suffered in filthy basements of crowded tenements with no hope of escape. Riis pioneered the use of flash, relying upon one of the highly flammable methods, like the use of flash powder ignited in a frying pan. The other key reformer of the time was an even finer photographer, one of my favorites, Lewis Hine. His primary focus was upon child labor in mines, on farms, I love that, and factories, using a selective focus that left backgrounds and foregrounds blurred. His lens zeroed in on the faces of his young subjects, sometimes oblivious to their plight, but more often haunted by hopelessness. Poverty was at the very heart of Depression-era America in the 30s. The U.S. government enlisted a squad of photographers to document the economic and social devastation caused by a confluence of forces, most notably the stock market crash on Wall Street and the historic drought in the Southwest known as the Dust Bowl. Arthur Rothstein, a member of the team, recorded this and the following unforgettable images. Dorothea Lange's migrant mother became the iconic image of the desperation. It's illuminating to compare the most famous shot with the session's outtakes, like this, highlighting the importance of artistry in expressing social concerns. Her final image, a close-up, illuminates all but the essential. The averted gaze of her offspring expresses their despair while focusing our eye upon the desolate face of their mother. During the 30s, one disaster followed another. The great Margaret Burke White captured the painful irony of victims of the 1937 Louisville flood as they wait patiently in a bread line. And just as the jobless, the homeless, and the hopeless wandered the streets of the nation, so too did its photographic core. The civil rights movement of 60s America brings us nearly full circle to where we began with the camera's record of slavery 100 years earlier. The brutal police response to peaceful protests was witnessed in living rooms nationwide, achieving more to promote reform than authorities could ever have imagined. Marchers locking hands of different colors as they sang "We Shall Overcome" conveyed a powerful message, but for me, two transcendent images embody the cause. First, Ruby Bridges was barely 6 years old in 1960 when she became the first African-American student to integrate a Southern elementary school. As her first day ends, she is shielded from a jeering crowd by U.S. Marshals, a measure required for a full year. And the second, Martin Luther King, as he delivers the stirring words, "I had a dream." But how could these moments even be necessary 100 years after the abolition of slavery? And how could George Floyd be killed another 60 years later? I had intended to include a shot of his death, but had second thoughts. It is simply too wrenching. But with the advent of the cell phone camera, the entire world witnessed his murder, inspiring citizens around the globe to express their outrage, and of course, these rallies were documented by the camera. We might also ask, how can war still ravage the planet even when its devastation is documented with photography's unprecedented immediacy and intensity? Photographers continued to record marching soldiers and the camp life of the First World War, but with technical improvements and smaller cameras requiring less light and shorter exposures, images of frontline combat became possible. Combined with advances in aviation, the camera became a weapon, as aerial reconnaissance was drastically improved. As pigeons were among the first era of photographers using them. That's a shot taken by this little guy. Where was I here? Yeah, pigeons. As pigeons were replaced by kites, which were used in World War I, and kites were replaced by balloons, which were also used, and by dirigibles, ditto. So too in more recent, and even by airplanes. So too in more recent years, helicopters have been improved and replaced in turn by drones, both large and small. In fact, it seems that every scientific advance enables a new means of laying waste and killing one another, finally making outer space part of our battlefield. But even a simple camera, handheld outside the fuselage of a biplane, could determine new targets, as we see being mapped in this map room. And new destruction could be documented. This is the city of Ypres in France, and from the air. Of course, every forward move brought new dangers as well, and new subjects for the camera. Military leaders tried to ban new miniature cameras from the battlefield. They posed a distraction while recording scenes their commanders did not always want shared. For once, the commanders lost. So we have a record of infantry heading over the top, some never to return, and battle charges by antiquated French cavalry. The common foot soldier and sailor recorded the heat of battle on both land and sea, and documented the cost of new murderous instruments like poison gas, whether the top brass liked it or not. And unfortunately, in war, no one is exempt. But at last there came an end to the war, but at what cost? It is said, to the victors go the spoil, but now the expression took on a horribly literal truth. And in truth, war never ends, for as one finally stops, another has already begun. In 1931, for example, Japan invaded mainland China, and the conflict continued until the defeat of Japan 15 years later. Photography itself became a weapon as propaganda ignited the next war. Hitler's rise was enabled by the skillful direction of filmmaker Leni Riefenstahl. In fact, she helped to orchestrate the monumental events like the 1936 Nuremberg rally for the purpose of shooting her epic documentary, Triumph of the Will. Hitler's histrionics were tailor-made for her lens. Images of landmarks in flames were impossible but true, dragging the world over the precipice, leading to the heartbreaking separation of families, all preserved on film. This then famous shot shows a 6-year-old Canadian boy breaking free from his mother to bid his father farewell. While in Poland, German soldiers and stormtroopers proudly photographed their own crimes against humanity. Combat photographers needed to be just as courageous as the soldiers and sailors at their side, whether landing on the beaches of Normandy or parachuting over occupied France on D-Day. Famed photographer Robert Capa braved the chilled sea and flying bullets, only to have nearly all his film accidentally destroyed in a London darkroom. Many young men never made it off the beach. Photographers like W. Eugene Smith risked their lives alongside flight crews over Europe and at soldiers' sides on Iwo Jima, where he was nearly killed. Smith also captured quiet moments of overwhelming emotion. The intrepid Margaret Bourke White not only shot the aerial war, but was with the Allied troops when they liberated Auschwitz, burning unspeakable horrors onto film. And while no comparison can be made, America had camps for its own citizens. This heartbreaking image of a little tag girl holding her doll heading off to Manzanar is evidence of the special power of the camera. After the victory in Europe, Japan still remained, and from Pearl Harbor to Hiroshima, the camera was there. But just as America approached war's final days, the nation lost the man who led it out of the Depression and into the war. When FDR passed away, the world seemed changed. And the world was indeed about to change forever. A few members of the crew of the Enola Gay smiled for the camera before dropping the bomb. At last, the war ended and celebration erupted. And that 6-year-old in Canada, his wait was rewarded. We cannot recount every battle since then, but one last conflict occupies an especially relevant place, the first televised war, Vietnam. For the camera played a decisive role in the war. Its horrors traumatized our nation as they played in millions of living rooms. And the protests inspired were seen in every home. But finally, it seemed that enough was enough. As one war has followed another, photography has evolved. The scratched and dust-covered image of troops marching off to the Mexican-American War has given way to the lurid color of this last tragic image. The photographer, Hilda Ortiz Clayton, and 4 Afghan soldiers died when a mortar accidentally exploded. 5 more victims paid war's senseless cost. Street photography. The term street photography is somewhat misleading in that it does not fully describe the broad range of images that fall under its heading. This Scottish calotype by Hill and Adamson comes from 1844, 5 years after the first camera was announced. Street photography is frequently shot without the subject's knowledge or permission, but not necessarily so. It can be considered the photographic equivalent of what in painting is categorized as genre. It can also be portrait or reportage. Simply stated, street photography records the human experience in public places. This 1852 image of a blind organ grinder on the streets of Paris by Charles Negret is one of the earliest known photographs in this category. Given the limitations of the era's photographic equipment, it was most likely posed for the camera. Diane Arbus's shot of these 2 teens was certainly taken with their knowledge, but it is unlikely that they were aware of her notoriety. Controversy surrounded Arbus's life and career based on the opinion that she exploited or mocked subjects unaware of the tacit social critique found in her work. This queasy public response has perpetually dogged the field as a whole. Arbus also photographed this right-wing youth. Its tone seems to ridicule his stance. Gary Winogrand was the contemporary street photographer most likely to capture his subjects unaware, unprepared, or unhappy to be his subject. Confrontation was a specialty. But this tone is not always present in the work of photographers on the street. No such accusation could be leveled at Lewis Hine. Over the years, a number of ploys have been used by photographers in order to capture their subjects unaware. Carl Stormer used one of the earliest detective cameras as he recorded candid portraits on the street of 1900 Oslo. Stormer used this unwieldy disc model concealed under a vest or jacket as its inner workings revolve to expose a circular negative for each new image. Other models of the era were constructed to look like luggage or parcels, but the Bowler camera took the cake with his button on top. The great Paul Strand, while setting off on his path towards straight photography, used a camera with a false lens fitted at right angles to the true one, lulling pedestrians into thinking he was recording a completely different subject as he snapped their image. But Strand's intention was not to exploit his subjects, but rather to illustrate the words of Henry David Thoreau that, quote, "The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation." Walker Evans hid his 35mm camera beneath his overcoat, operating by means of a cable release snaked down his arm, enabling a record of intimate emotion on the street or in his favorite haunt, New York's subway system. Evans took fellow street photographer Helen Levitt underground, seeking concealment in numbers. But Levitt's But children were Levitt's true specialty. She had been a preschool teacher in Queens, but relinquished the job in order to snap images of a childhood world with its singular seriousness alternating with moments of unbridled enthusiasm. She's good. Now for a grim detour. A brief look at Arthur Flegman, better known as Ouija. While Ouija took straightforward shots of children playing in the street, lovers of the movies and so on, he's best known for work he shot in Manhattan's Lower East Side as a press photographer during the 30s and 40s. Ouija developed his signature style by following the city's emergency services and documenting their activity. Much of his work depicts unflinchingly realistic scenes of urban life, crime, injury, and death. His work influenced generations of photographers and filmmakers, even working as a consultant and still photographer on Stanley Kubrick's 1963 nuclear comedy, Dr. Strangelove. It's not that surprising that they would be familiar with one another because Stanley Kubrick started out as a newspaper photographer. But unquestionably, the trailblazing gold standard of street photography was set by Robert Frank's 1958 book, The Emergence. In it, the Swiss expatriate documented the implicit contradictions that he felt characterized post-war America: lovers isolated in a world of anonymous strangers, a black caregiver holding a bleached white infant on a southern street corner, or a shoe shine in a subterranean men's room. Frank's photographs were grainy and grimy. They did not display the technical perfection demanded by the photographic critics of the time. His tone and method were adopted by many who followed. Figures like Gary Winogrand or Diane Arbus, two figures whose raw images often seemed to target their subjects rather than dignify them. In fact, Arbus once said, "Freaks was the thing I photographed a lot. It had a terrific excitement for me. I just used to adore them. I still do adore some of them." She also frankly confessed, "This photographing is really the business of stealing." Perhaps so, but for me, at the other end of the spectrum, the greatest of all photographers of the human condition was Henri Cartier-Bresson, whose mission was to seek out and record what he called the decisive moment, by which he meant the perfect subject, the perfect composition, caught at the perfect instant that conveys the deepest significance of life itself. Since Bresson, many great photographers like China's Fan Ho have followed in his footsteps, but none have filled his shoes. And now a very brief history of color photography. Not long after the invention of the first cameras, the desire for color took hold in all quarters. But for the metallic plate of the daguerreotype, this was a very tricky proposition. A few primitive photographic processes were attempted, and the means of coloring daguerreotypes plates using an electroplating process was developed, but it was dangerous and yielded mediocre results. As can be imagined, it was far simpler and successful to add color to an image on paper in a conventional manner like paint than to successfully fuse color by chemical or electrical means to a metallic or glass plate. Hand coloring grew in its popularity throughout Europe and America, but arguably reached its zenith towards the end of the century in faraway studios in Japan. But shortly after 1900, a method of producing genuine color photography was adopted by a Russian photographer named Sergei Gorsky. The method Gorsky used was first proposed by James Clerk Maxwell in 1855 and demonstrated in 1861. This tricolored ribbon was the first result of that process, but reliable results were not possible with the materials available at the time, and so the approach languished for decades. For this method, the visible spectrum of colors was divided into three channels of information by capturing it in the form of three black and white photographs, one taken through a red filter, one through a green filter, and one through a blue filter. The resulting 3 photographs could be projected one at a time through filters of the same colors using an optical device called the chromoscope that visually combined the 3 into one full color image. The results were beautifully evocative. Hard to believe that that was taken shortly after 1900. Hand coloring continued to be in widespread use, but in 1903, 2 pioneers of moving films, the Lumiere brothers, obtained a patent for their autochrome process, which was first marketed 4 years later. Now get this. Autochrome was an additive color mosaic screen plate process. The medium consists of a glass plate coated on one side with a random mosaic of microscopic grains of potato starch dyed red, orange, green, and blue-violet, which act as color filters. Lamp black fills the spaces between the grains, and a black and white panchromatic silver halide solution is coated on top of the filter layer. There will be a test. The remaining part of the process becomes even more complex to describe. The resultant color image had a chromatic grain to it, fine enough that the particles of color optically fused in the eye of the viewer. While the images were not entirely naturalistic, they had a special beauty all their own. The true heyday of color photography arrived with the advent of color film. A few processes had been developed in the early 1930s, but it was the introduction of Kodachrome in 1935 that brought color to the world. The technology was also extremely complex, but it did not need to be understood to appreciate the result. And predictably, the public went wild. Ava Gardner. And just a simple picture. But the critical community was not convinced. Color photography was not accepted, let alone embraced, until the 1960s, when a few brave figures like William Eggleston, whose work we see here, used color film to record an implicit critique of the mundane, the ugly, and the garish landscape they uncovered in mainstream America. John Zarkowski, the curator of photography at the Museum of Modern Art, championed Eggleston and gave him a controversial one-man show in 1976. Eggleston was followed in his use of color by such figures as Stephen Short, whose work we see here, and by Joel Meyerowitz. So, through the acceptable backdoor of criticizing or mocking the middle class and the commercialization of American society, color photography gradually became an accepted form of art, and it remains so today. Contemporary photography is as pluralistic in its themes and approaches as can be imagined. In addition to fine art, there are fabulous categories I cannot cover today, like sports and fashion, and I wish I could. But let's get to the contemporary fine art material in any event. Some contemporary photographers construct entire visual worlds, rich in color and effect, with tones that range from satiric to oppressive to mysterious or surreal. Others create austere images with an insistent political cast. LGBTQ messages abound, as does an ironic, iconoclastic take on society, its outmoded conventions, and most especially, its perceived flaws. In any event, there's no way that the vast range of contemporary imagery can be fully covered in an entire lecture, let alone the fraction of time I have remaining today. So I'll limit myself to a sampling from some major practitioners with just a word or two about their artistic process and product. Catherine Opie came to prominence in the 1990s for her uncompromising portraits of her peers in the lesbian, gay, and leather communities in Los Angeles and San Francisco. When just 8 years old, Opie wrote a book report on the photography of Louis Hine and was moved by his appetite for social reform. In Opie's words, Hine was able to change the law through his images of child labor, and I got very attached to the idea of what those pictures could do. I haven't stopped using the cameras since. Opie seeks to reveal the hidden intimacy in her portraits and does not limit her work to LGBTQ subjects. For example, she has also created a series of high school football players intended to unveil the inner uncertainty that is so often masked by shoulder pads and macho posturing. Zanel Muhali is a South African photographer who questions societal assumptions about appearance and identity. Adorned with stereotypical accessories, her self-portraits stare out at the viewer, turning social conventions inside out, conferring a dignity upon her images for the sheer perfection of her craft. In 2019, Muhali created 365 self-portraits for the series Somnyama and Gonyama Zulu, translated as Hail the Dark Lioness. Maurice Berger, author of the seminal work on contemporary photography, Ways of Seeing, observes the self-portraits function on various levels and pay homage to the history of black women in Africa and beyond. The Dark Lionesses of the book's title. They reimagine black identity in ways that are largely personal but inevitably political, and they challenge the stereotypes and oppressive standards of beauty that often ignore people of color. Seeing these works secondhand, that is outside the arena of public exhibition, robs them of some degree of their power, for the prints, like much of the work we will see moving forward, are monumental in scale. Shirin Neshat. Shirin Neshat is an Iranian visual artist living in New York City. She was raised in Iran prior to immigrating to America in 1975 in order to study art at UC Berkeley. The uneasy transformative juncture of Iran and the West informs her work in both still photography and video. Upon her return to her homeland in 1990, she was shocked by the way the nation had come to undermine basic human rights. In Neshat's own words, this caused her to, quote, gravitate toward making art that is concerned with tyranny, dictatorship, oppression, and political injustice. Although I don't consider myself an activist, I believe my art, regardless of its nature, is an expression to confront the discrepancy between the culture of oppression and that of the pre-revolution Iran in which she was raised. She began her first mature body of work, the Women of Allah series, portraits of women entirely overlaid by Persian calligraphy. Her work, like that of Muhali, relies in part on its epic scale to exert a dramatic impact. Richard Mossy. Richard Mossy is an Irish conceptual documentary photographer. He has worked in Iraq, Iran, Pakistan, Palestine, Haiti, and former Yugoslavia, and I guess he's lived to tell of it. In 2012, he documented the war in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo using a large format camera and now discontinued infrared film, which registers light invisible to humans, rendering the grass and trees and soldiers' uniforms in vivid hues of lavender, crimson, and hot pink. Critic Sean O'Hagan, writing in The Guardian, commented, Mossy's images from the Congo often seem to skirt the real and the fictional simply through their heightened and unreal color. He has made the familiar seem strange and the real seem heightened to the point of absurdity. This is war reportage, but not as we know it. A part of Mossy's vision in these images, is to focus on the Congo's lush and bountiful landscape, while the West seems only to see the nation's darkness and insanity. Robert Mapplethorpe was an American photographer, best known for his black and white photographs featuring an array of subjects, including celebrity portraits. Here we see Mapplethorpe himself and Grace Jones. He also shot male and female nudes, self-portraits, and still life images. His best known and most controversial works examined the gay male BDSM, bondage, discipline, sadism, and masochism, subculture of New York City in the late 60s and early 70s. A 1989 exhibition of his work titled Robert Mapplethorpe, The Perfect Moment, sparked a heated debate in the United States concerning both use of public funds for obscene artwork and the constitutional limits of free speech in America. His body of work features an exquisitely refined technical craft and visual aesthetic, emphasizing not just the erotic aspect of his subject matter, but its abstract nature as well. Tragically, his life was cut short. At the age of 42, he died from complication of HIV. And now a U-turn. From political and sexual iconoclast to perhaps the most neutral of photographic groundbreakers, the wife and husband team of Bernd and Hill Becher were German conceptual artists and photographers intrigued by the fact that so many industrial buildings seem to have been built with a great deal of attention toward design. Using an 8 by 10 inch view camera, they photographed these buildings with a straightforward, objective point of view. The pair shot only on overcast days and in early morning during spring and fall in order to avoid shadows and record their subject matter with as little mood or atmosphere as possible. As they collated thousands of pictures of cooling towers, gas tanks, and coal bunkers, it became apparent that the structure shared many distinctive formal qualities. This fact was further emphasized by the Betchers' frequent practice of exhibiting their work in grids. A strange contradictory balance exists between an appreciation of the abstract form and the oppressive monotony of the groupings that they created. As photographers, theorists, and teachers, the Betchers have exerted an immense influence upon countless subsequent artists. In fact, Thomas Struth, who we see here, was one of their students, and like his mentors, shot the same basic architectural subject, deserted urban streets, in the same central angle, time and time and time and time again. Struth made unyieldingly neutral views, rich in detail, yet seeming to reflect no emotional investment or special point of focus. In a paradoxical manner, the very similarity of these compositions accentuates their differences. Eventually, Struth moved on to new, obsessive conceptual concerns, museum gallery spaces, and the humans that populate them. Initially, these works tended to include both art object and observer, but Struth gradually shifted to focus exclusively upon the audience itself. The viewers of Struth's photographs experienced a direct identification with those portrayed in his enormous prints. Now, Andreas Gursky, who relies a good deal on constructing these images, not just from a single shot, but he does it digitally, but creating something that looks like the actual location. Andreas Gursky also studied with the Betcher. He shoots large format color photographs of massive human assemblies, architecture, and landscape, often using an elevated point of view. He uses this imagery to explore the oppressive monotony of today's society. This picture is a Times Square hotel, is large for a photograph, 6 by 8 feet. It measures itself not against its mammoth subject, but against the human viewer and against other works of art. Once again, scale impacts the effect. In fact, the dwarfing of the individual within the enormous crush of human beings forms a further subject for Gursky, whether at a stock exchange in Chicago or a stadium in North Korea. Gursky's works sell for some of the highest prices in the art market among living photographers. This photograph, Rhine 2, ironically featuring extreme emptiness rather than Gursky's usual multitudinous crush, sold for $4,338,500 in 2011. Next, we'll take a look at a handful of photographers who show little interest in the actual environment around us, but instead are obsessed with constructing their own subversive universe. It may appear that Thomas Demand focuses his lens on banal interior spaces that as a part of our normal life could easily be taken for granted, but the truth is far more surprising and complex. Actually, Demand constructs life-size artificial spaces out of paper, photographs these constructions, and then demolishes them. What seems strikingly familiar is wholly unreal. Appearances in Demand's work are insistently, perversely deceptive. Seb Agnew. Seb Agnew's interiors appear unreal due to their strikingly synthetic color and the incongruity of their inhabitants, but these are merely the tips of his artifice. The settings are actually painstaking miniatures constructed in his workshop, into which he inserts his photographed human figures. Diametrically opposite in process and scale, a disturbing tableau orchestrated by Gregory Crutzen, who requires an entire film crew, cranes, massive lights, and cast of actors. The import of Crusen's mysterious scenario suggests that nothing is what it seems, that threat and dread hover even the most mundane street corners and living rooms. He also acknowledges that he loves Close Encounters. Jeff Wall fashions ambiguous narrative excerpts that seem familiar through his use of realistic settings, but perplex or upset the viewer due to their uncomfortable implications in the irresistible attraction of their intense color and gargantuan scale. Most of his pieces are backlit transparencies, intensifying the supersaturations of his color. Finally, opposed to these fictional tableaux, gushing with social references, we end this section with an artist who features minimalist simplicity. Hiroshi Sugimoto records a number of different subjects, but the most profoundly Zen of these are the stark images of the sea and the air, reducing the world to its irreducible essence, space, and light. And if you bear with me one last moment, hopefully I've earned your indulgence, I want to close by sharing my two very favorite photograph images, both focusing upon the purest, most profound of all entities and the very basis of photography, and that is light itself. First, Henri Cartier-Bresson's portrait of Kashmiri women as they welcome and worship the dawn. And last of all, W. Eugene Smith's first photograph after 2 years of recuperation from his wounds from the Second World War. His two children emerging from the darkness of the forest into the light of a clearing, a timeless symbol of life's journey. And that's it. Thank you very much. If there are any questions, I don't know if I can answer them, but sure.
What was the camera that was making visible in pink light?
Oh, that's infrared film.
Yeah.
I mean, the
Was that just
Congo?
infrared?
Yeah, infrared. They have infrared black and white film, which gave you like amazing skies, like the clouds which are really intense. But they also made infrared color. And that responded to really not the visual spectrum, but to the cameras, really certain that things were constructed of. So, and that's no longer available, but of course with digital technology, you can make your own infrared effect if you want.
But, infrared that I commonly see when I was meeting, in those photographs, it was a pink, sort of pink light.
Yeah.
It was much more beautiful than most infrared things, when they portray what infrared would look like.
Yeah, I used to shoot infrared because I was into review. And the results are somewhat unpredictable, but generally speaking, if you photograph a really drenched green, it would go to magenta. There you go. Okay, well, I really want to thank everyone for coming. It's a beautiful day out, so enjoy it. And hopefully you got something out of the presentation.